Hello, everyone. This is Jan Hasbrouck. I'm presenting today this session on reading fluency. So I'll get my screen share up so we can see these slides together. I want to talk to you about reading fluency in terms of what we have learned about this important component of reading since the year 2000. Part of what I'm going to share with you comes from this book that I had the great honor and privilege and a great deal of fun actually writing with my colleague Deb Glazer. It's a pretty comprehensive but not too complex overview of reading, defining what it is, talking about assessing reading fluency, and then a couple of chapters on teaching reading fluency. Some of you might know my work related to fluency in terms of the studies that I did with Jerry Tyndall over a 25-year period where we compiled scores for oral reading fluency and published these percentile rankings. And we'll be talking a little bit about that today as well. I was also asked to contribute a chapter on this topic about what we've learned about reading fluency since the publication of the National Reading Panel report in the United States. The organization, the Reading League, has a regular journal that they put out, and they had a special issue updating folks on what we've learned since the initial research report published by the reading panel in the year 2000. And as I said, I wrote the chapter on fluency. So some of what I'm going to share with you today comes from what I wrote in that chapter. In the United States National Reading Panel report, the chapters included an overview of the different methodologies that were being used at that point to study reading, and they had chapters on alphabetics, which combined phonemic awareness and phonics, a chapter on fluency, one on comprehension that combined vocabulary and text comprehension instruction, and additional chapters on teacher education and technology as well. So my part of contribution to the updated version was on fluency. So in 2021, what do we know about defining reading fluency? In the National Reading Panel report, they defined fluency as the ability to read text quickly, accurately, and with expression, and recognize that fluency depends upon well-developed word recognition skills, essentially sight words, but such skills do not inevitably lead to fluency. So acknowledging that it's a little bit more complex than that. In an updated version of Reading Fluency that I submitted to the Reading Journal, the Reading League Journal, I did talk about an understanding of fluency as being something that develops over time. And we can thank Marianne Wolf and her colleague for drawing our attention to that often when we talk about fluency, we start to think about text reading fluency, and that's certainly an important part of what fluency is and was kind of the focus of the National Reading Panel report. But Marianne and colleague reminded us that reading fluency actually develops in progressions, that sub-skills need to develop first before we can even think about text reading fluency. And correctly pointed out that it happens in progressions of accuracy, then automaticity across many sub-skills, such as the letter name, letter patterns, the sounds of letters, the sounds that are represented by letters. Fluency happens at the word level, and then at phrase level, at the semantic and syntactic processes. So we start with becoming reasonably accurate, and then building rate to automaticity in those sub skills. Then we hope it can lead to fluent and effortless reading of text. And the value of that is so that our brains are not focused on what the letters are, what the words are, what the phrases are, but instead what was the intended meaning from the author of that text. When Deb and I wrote our book, we used all that had come before us to define fluency and included a definition that was similar to the National Reading Report, but differed in at least one important way. We talked about accuracy first, rather than the National Reading Panel saying it's the ability to read quickly. We included rate as our second component, but we said first that fluency included reasonably accurate reading at an appropriate rate with suitable expression. And we could have left it there. That was essentially, although a slightly different order, that was essentially the National Reading Panel definition. But we went ahead and added that fluency should never be disconnected from its overall purpose. And the purpose is to hopefully lead a reader to accurate and deep comprehension and the motivation to read. We also uh, mentioned in our book that we believe that when we look at science as well as clinical practice, that the performance standards for these three components should vary depending on the demands of the task. So not just talking about accuracy, rate, and expression, but what are the performance standards for those? And they are not hard and fast all the time. They should, in fact, vary. So we use the terms reasonably accurate reading, an appropriate rate with suitable expression. So let's talk a little bit more about what we meant by that. In terms of reasonably accurate reading, this is really important to emphasize. We put it first in our definition and we wanted to emphasize it. So we included a lot of powerful F words in this description of reasonably accurate. And these are the F words we were talking about. Accuracy is what comes first. That's what Wolf and Katz and Cohen were talking about, that we have accuracy at the letter, sound, word, and phrase level that comes first. And accuracy is that the component we must be paying attention to first. It's also, of the components of reading, it is really of foremost importance, because if accuracy is not at a reasonable level, then the purpose of fluent reading, which is comprehension, is going to there's going to be a negative impact on that. And it's not just what we should consider first, it is what we should consider foremost importance across the year. So forever, accuracy, reasonable accuracy, is the foundation of fluency. So that gets all those 5 F's in there. First, foremost, and forever, accuracy is that foundation of fluency. And that's a good way to conceptualize it and to think about it, but it doesn't really help us measure how well our students are doing with accuracy. So we can turn to research for that. We know that the research in accuracy has suggested that when students are reading, when any reader is reading independently, that a good goal is to achieve at least 95% accuracy. And that comes from the fact that once accuracy in reading falls, it doesn't have to fall very much, but when it falls below 95%, comprehension will be affected. So we want to maintain that. When we're in an instructional situation where we're providing instruction to an individual student or to a group of students, I think the research is quite compelling that we should help our students achieve 100% accuracy by correcting errors as they occur. So that's in instruction. This number, 95%, is for independent reading, and we aim for that in general to maintain reasonable accuracy. And then what about our emerging readers, those beginning readers? Should it be the same? Should it be lower because they're just beginning? The research actually suggests that for our beginning readers, again, aiming for independent reading, it should be even higher. We need to really be sure that we're not asking these children to try to read text that's too difficult for them. So even when they're reading independently, they should be reading text that has words that have been pre-taught, words that they have sufficient practice decoding and recognizing so that their reading is quite accurate at those beginning levels. And just like the National Reading Panel emphasized, accuracy in reading really depends greatly on accurate word reading, along with a well-established orthographic lexicon, a more technical term for sight words. We need a certain number of sight words in order to maintain the fluidity and accuracy of our reading. When we use the term sight word, it's probably worth spending a little bit of time defining because people use these words very differently. There's a common usage for this term, but there's also one that's more grounded in uh, an accurate definition based on research. A common use of the term sight words would be used to label irregular words that have one or more irregular phoneme or grapheme patterns, such as the word one or have or was or of. Our English language is full of those irregular words. It's sometimes implied that that term sight words indicates that it would be applied to words that for some reason need to be learned looking at the whole word. So they're learned by sight rather than a sounding out uh, using our decoding skills or sounding out the word. But neither of those terms are actually correct. The more accurate research-grounded definition would be that a sight word is any word that has been previously learned and then is recognized instantaneously and precognitively by a reader. Once a word has become mapped orthographically in our brain, it is nearly impossible to avoid reading it, to subvert its recognition. So it'd be much more accurate to label words as irregular words or high frequency words, because those are labels we can put on a word. A sight word is not a label of a word. A sight word is a sight word unique to each individual reader. So their sight words can vary from person to person. So when we talk about reasonably accurate, we need to maintain at least 95% accuracy to sustain comprehension. But it can be sometimes 95% accuracy would not be at all reasonable if we're reading something very high stakes. If you're reading the directions for taking a prescription medicine, we want to be more than 95% accurate. We want to aim for 100% accuracy as the pilots go through their checklist when they're about to take off a plane. 95% accuracy in that reading is probably not acceptable. It's not reasonable in a case like that. And there are other times when we're simply reading for fun, for pleasure, for relaxation. Comprehension may not be our goal, and it may be perfectly reasonable to read with much less accuracy. So it depends on the needs of the test. But in general, around 95% or higher accuracy for established readers, 97 to 98% when reading independently for our beginning readers. So how about rate? We use the qualifier or the standard of appropriate rate. If we took what we see in many classrooms these days, we'd have to believe that appropriate rate is absolutely as fast as humanly possible, but that is not true. I love this statement from Steve Stahl and Melanie Kuhn back in 2002, where they guided us in terms of rate by saying fluent reading should sound like speech. And that applies to the accuracy of speech too. We're very tolerant of our fellow human beings when we're speaking, that every word doesn't have to be pronounced 100% accuracy. Most of the words do, or we won't understand it. But in terms of rate, the rate of reading should mirror ultimately an approximate rate of speed, which does vary, but that's all about comprehension. If we're reading and we're reading at a rate that is much faster than speech, we may overwhelm our brain and not be able to understand it, because our brain is, in fact, biologically supported and wired through uh, eons of human evolution to make sense of spoken language. So that rate is really sort of a sweet spot for comprehension. So too fast can overwhelm our brain and impede comprehension, as well as too slowly can also impede comprehension. So we're really aiming for, ultimately, while we're maintaining that accuracy, to build fluent reading at a rate of speech. But again, that doesn't give us very specific guidelines, which is one of the reasons that Jerry Tyndall and I, over that period of about 25 years, created sets of norms for oral reading fluency and ours are all were created originally on unpracticed, excuse me, grade level text. So this is our the chart, the graph from our most recent study done in 2017, where we compiled scores on unpracticed grade level text. Students read for 1 minute. We calculate using a standardized procedure, calculated words correct per minute, and then created these percentiles so people could see how students from the middle of first grade across the other grades up through 6, 3 times a year, beginning, middle, and end of the year, how those students are reading. When we look at those percentile rankings, the percentile that we recommend in terms of a generally appropriate rate is the 50th percentile. And that surprises a lot of people because the 50th percentile is, in fact, average. And there are very few things where we say average is optimal or even appropriate. But in this case, we took our guidance from the research that said there's really very limited evidence, either from research or theory or clinical practice, that suggests that those students who are reading above the 75th percentile are actually better comprehenders, which is really the measure of reading that we should be paying attention to. We know there are readers above the 50th percentile. There's significant numbers of them, but we don't have evidence that those students are better comprehenders. And we do know if your rate is above the 50th percentile, if you're reading too fast, that can actually be detrimental to comprehension. And we recommend reaching at least the 50th percentile, because here we have significant evidence from many decades of research that reading below the 50th percentile, independent reading below the 50th percentile, does have a negative impact on comprehension and motivation. So as part of your handouts, we also included this chart, which takes away all the extraneous numbers and just leaves the 50th percentile, but also acknowledges in the colored zones below that each of these numbers has a essentially a confidence interval around them, that we would want a student to read in the range of the 50th percentile, but going 4 words below that, up to 10 or more above that can be perfectly fine. We call that the green zone. Readers who fall from 5 to 10 words below the identified 50th percentile really fall into a yellow zone. We can't really say one way or the other if they are in any kind of trouble around their rate or overall proficiency or not. But the research is pretty compelling that any student whose oral reading fluency or words correct per minute score falls more than 10 below any of these numbers at the 50th percentile, that something's amiss, and we should be looking at some kind of intervention. And that intervention would be guided by doing some diagnostic assessment, not just relying on the words correct per minute score itself. Then we went one step further and looked at some guidelines for the end of the year score based on the spring 50th percentile, but to make it neat and tidy and easy to remember, we took those 50th percentile scores and either bumped them up or down a little bit just to make a nice even score, easy for teachers to remember, easy to talk to parents about, and for students as well, getting them involved in moving across the year toward gains, toward some specific goals for oral reading fluency measured in words correct per minute. But even these numbers have confidence intervals around them. So when we talk about appropriate rate, we do have the evidence from the Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms, the guidance from those norms, that the appropriate rate should be somewhere around the 50th percentile. 50th to 75% percentiles would probably be appropriate for most reading, although there are times when it is appropriate to slow down significantly. We're reading something that's very important that might be quite complex or difficult, it would be very appropriate to slow down, at least for the first reading. And again, when we're reading just for pleasure, fun, enjoyment, relaxation, who cares how fast we read? We can sacrifice some accuracy. Also, there's skimming and scanning text where our rate might really pick up. So appropriate rate can vary, but in general, the range of the 50th to 75th percentile on the Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms would be a good guidance for that. And our final component is the expression, and Deb and I use the term suitable expression. And we can go back to Steve Stahl and Melanie Kuhn talking about fluent reading should sound like speech. And again, that ties into the purpose, the value of fluent reading, which is comprehension. Our brain's wired to recognize spoken language. If we can mirror the rate, the tone, the fluidity, the the emphasis that comes in spoken language, if we can mirror that in our reading, that facilitates comprehension. We also, so those components, that pitch, tone, volume, we want to mirror spoken language as much as possible to convey the meaning of what is written. But some of the newer research written since the National Reading Panel does suggest that we can use expression more to judge whether comprehension has happened. It can be difficult to apply suitable expression to print if we don't understand what the print is. Some of you who may be second or third language learners have experienced this where you're proficient to the point where you can recognize what words are, but you may not fully understand what the words mean. So, are these, should this be written, should this be read with an expression of terror at a loud volume? Is the tone rather ominous and dangerous, or not? If you don't understand what the words mean, it can be hard to use the appropriate expression. So that's some of our current thinking around expression, and that um, uh, contributes too to our thinking about teaching expression. When we have always limited time, uh, if we're thinking about comprehension as the most important outcome of reading, then we may not want to spend quite as much time on teaching our students to read with proper expression. Spend much more time on the accuracy and the rates. Not at all that expression is of no value, but it's not as much a contributor to comprehension as accuracy and rate. So suitable expression, most of the time mirroring spoken language. Other times, especially when we're reading silently, it's much less an issue. And there are times too when we would be much more dramatic than typical speech when we're making a presentation or doing a dramatic reading of some sort. But those three components of fluency are definitely worth our time and attention and understanding. But it is actually a little bit more complex than that, because behind the scenes, there are all these mechanics going on. The mechanics of fluency include the decoding skills, those phoneme awareness, the letter sounds and phonograms that have to be understood by a reader. Then we take the words and put them into connected text, and we need orthographic knowledge. We need the sight words, the skills in decoding connected text, the multiple cue efficiency that needs to be developed, and then the comprehension skills are all playing a role in helping us become skillful and truly fluent readers. So we need to understand that fluency is certainly more complex than just reading quickly, reading accurately, and reading with good expression. So what do we know about the role of fluency? I've talked about it a little bit already. In our book, we talk about fluency as being necessary for reading comprehension, but fluency alone is not sufficient. We need lots of other things going on, including vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge. But it is this thing that we call reading, and reading comprehension is really complex. And we are very grateful to Goff and Tunmer, who helped us understand that this very complex thing called reading, we could view it in a more a simple way. So they hypothesized or suggested that reading comprehension is the outcome in a simple formula of language comprehension times decoding. It is a product of those two, where language comprehension is the ability to understand spoken language, where decoding is the ability to decode new words and recognize familiar words. And when we apply this to what we understand reading to be in all its complexity, which can be represented in many ways. This is simply one way that Valentino and colleagues represented as after doing a multivariate analysis of the skills that we understand to be involved in reading. This was a publication in 2007. If you go to the far right, the center circle of the three says reading comprehension. That is our always our goal of reading, but all this other stuff has to happen. Way over to the far left, it starts off with a visual coding and a phonological coding, and then goes through this incredible process of all these different components and how they interact with each other. The numbers there, which are probably too small for you to see, but those are the weighted value of contribution of each of these multiple components. So when we take this complexity, we can, in fact, we can't make it less complex, but we can take a more simple view by saying that reading comprehension ultimately is the product, is the outcome of language comprehension and decoding. So what we have is a simple view of this complex process. And I'm also grateful for the work of Hollis Scarborough and her very famous rope, where she demonstrates what fluency, essentially what fluent reading should look like. And we could represent this as reading comprehension. She labels it in the box as the representation of skilled reading, the fluent execution and coordination of word recognition and text comprehension, those two pieces, the LC and the D together. So this is a lovely, beautiful, uh, good, based on research, representation, infographic, if you will, of the complexity of reading and the outcome of fluency, that tightly woven rope. But all the individual pieces need to be there at a level of accuracy and then automaticity and coordinated together to achieve that outcome of reading fluency. So in our book, we talked about the role of reading fluency. It has been discussed as a bridge between beginning reading and more skillful reading. Pikulski and Chard, one of the people who talked about that analogy of connecting the ability to identify individual words and constructing meaning, weaving in that vocabulary and comprehension, that fluency can can function as a bridge between those two components. We also, in our book, suggested another way of thinking about the role of fluency, particularly when we think about rate. We talked about rate or fluency as a doorway that stands between a reader and comprehension and motivated reading, with this idea that at one side of the door, until you have achieved sufficient fluency, that combination of accuracy and rate with expression, then that door remains closed and you cannot really, no matter what your motivation, access comprehension, motivation. You can't really construct meaning. But when you reach a certain level of fluency, that door opens. But there's really no value to opening it wider, to getting students to read faster so that that door opens more widely. A reasonable level of fluency allows access to comprehension, and that all the wonderful things that await a skilled reader. So when we talk about the role of reading fluency, of course, we have to talk about accuracy because, as I shared, comprehension is limited by inaccurate reading, and it doesn't have to fall much below 95%. Rate is also important because comprehension is limited by inefficient, slow, laborious reading, or it can be limited by reading too quickly. And we also know this. Anyone who has worked with struggling readers is very familiar with this very sad equation here, that our students who lack fluency lack motivation. And that results in reading less. They read fewer words. And that results for many of these students in a smaller vocabulary. Many of us continue to build our vocabulary because of the words we encounter in print. And the smaller vocabulary then limits comprehension. And then that becomes this sad and self-perpetuating um, uh, equation of reading. So we can summarize easily the role of reading fluency as being all about comprehension, 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 and motivation. So, what do we know about assessing fluency in 2021? In the National Reading Panel, they talked about assessing fluency this way. They said that informal reading inventories, miscue analysis, prosody rating scales, running records, and reading speed calculations as a label that they used for oral reading fluency. They said that all of these assessment procedures can be used to provide an adequate index of fluency. Um, and I would counter, and in the article in the Reading League Journal chapter on fluency, I said that today, in that I believe few would agree that reading speed calculations are adequate assessments of reading fluency, primarily because I think we've really over 20 years come to understand what a complex construct fluency is. It isn't just how quickly and accurately you read. So I think we've moved beyond that a little bit. However, that reading speed calculation, the oral reading fluency or ORF assessment still has an important role for us in as educators across the grade levels. When we do assess the number of words that a student reads correctly per minute using that standardized procedure of oral reading fluency, where students are given unpracticed passages, they read aloud for 60 seconds, and for most decisions, we're using grade level text. And we have these days many commercially available forms of those assessments. When they were first developed, it was just some guidelines for how to do the procedures, but now universities and publishing companies have developed these commercially available forms of ORF assessment. But Jerry and I were working way back when, before those DIBELS or AIMSweb or EasyCBM existed. So that was really our impetus for doing our studies across the years, because there were no guidelines. It was simply a set of procedures to use. And it was suggested that you set up your own benchmarks and norms for oral reading fluency. So in 1992, we did our first initial study, a relatively small study. Very few people were doing ORF assessments back then, so we calculated. We accessed about 15,000 scores from students and created some percentile norms and published those. By 2006, there were much greater interest in oral reading fluency as an assessment, widely used, and many more published versions of it, commercially available versions. But we still felt that having agnostic norms that were not connected to any specific assessment might be valuable. So we uh, conducted our study once again, this time with 250,000 scores, this time from the middle of first grade up through 8th grade, and published that study. And then the most recent study, very likely our final study, published in 2017, and this is available as a technical report at the Behavioral Research and Teaching Group at the University of Oregon at this website. It's Technical Report 1702. And the interest in ORF continues to grow. This time we had access to slightly over 6 million scores from students from a variety of some of those different commercially available oral reading fluency assessments, and then use those to compile these norms. And there were slight differences across the years. Some of the biggest gains were done, were noticed at the lower percentile rankings, which indicates to me that with the more attention being placed to helping our students become fluent readers, that we weren't letting as many children at the low ends of proficiency fall between the cracks. So using ORF as one of the measures of fluency is definitely highly recommended. But when we're overall deciding how fluent should students be, we want them to be able, so we have to go back and look at those components of fluency. We want them to be able to read unpracticed grade level text with sufficient accuracy. So those guidelines I gave you previously of at least 95% on unpracticed text, even higher for our emerging readers, would be the first thing we should look at for fluency. When we're looking at rate, we can turn to the Hasbrouck and Tyndall norms that give us some guidelines around words correct per minute. And as I suggested, the 50th percentile or slightly higher would be an appropriate rate for most readers. And then we want to take a look at expression to truly judge a student's fluency. And for expression at this point, I know that there are people looking at ways to use computer and automatized print speech to judge prosody. But right now what we have are rating scales, and there are several available. The National Assessment of Educational Progress has a rating scale of 4 different levels. They have quite a bit more guidance than provided here, but in general, level 1 is just that simple word by word reading, moving through the phases up through expressive interpretation of printed text that mirrors spoken language. So we'll wrap up with a discussion of teaching, which was really minimally addressed in the original report, National Reading Panel report. They were just more identifying what are the components. But so what do we know about teaching fluency in the year 2021? I love the way that Roxanne Hudson and her colleagues described teaching fluency, talking about the growth of reading fluency in all its multifaceted glory is an outcome of many different kinds of instruction. And when I think about that, and I think of that multifaceted glory, it takes me right back to Scarborough's rope and thinking about all these component skills. So when they talk about many different types of instruction, the instruction would be very different to build background knowledge, to increase a student's vocabulary, to address the other aspects of language comprehension, and then phonological and phoneme awareness, decoding, and sight word recognition. So yes, indeed, it is a multifaceted, glorious aspect of reading, and it does require that we provide many different kinds of instruction to achieve that end goal. And then that instruction needs to be coupled with large amounts of carefully orchestrated reading practice. And going back to Scarborough's rope, I think that that's carefully orchestrated practice is represented by this part of the rope, where we've established the component skills to a level of individual skill proficiency, we hope, because that's going to be required. But then through skillful, carefully orchestrated practice, and lots of it, we begin to more tightly weave that rope together until we hope for most students that they will achieve skilled reading, the fluent execution, the coordination of all those individual components. In my article in the Reading League Journal, I also quoted my colleague, Tim Shanahan, who said that fluency instruction should be presented as a coordination task, very much in alignment with Hudson's and colleague, that would require readers to integrate and consolidate their abilities to orchestrate several skills and abilities simultaneously. So this idea that fluency is just reading fast, I hope has been fully dispelled when we talk about consolidating multiple skills and orchestrating and coordinating. Just that alone helps us understand the complexity of becoming a truly fluent reader. And I also talked about silent reading because not all reading, of course, is done orally. And in the Reading League article, that article in the Reading League Journal, I talked about that silent reading. We know it can play an important role and does play an important role in improving and strengthening reading for our students with established foundational skills. If you're familiar with the instructional hierarchy, the work of Herring and White and colleagues from the 1970s, where skills move through a hierarchy of initial acquisition through fluent proficiency to generalization and application later. If a student is still learning to read fluently, then we need to be thinking about the value of silent reading. Once students have achieved this level of proficiency, they are skilled reading, then allowing them, even encouraging them to read silently can further tighten that rope, can have great benefit from them. When our students are still in this acquisition or fluency building stages of the instructional hierarchy, we need to be cautious about how often we allow or encourage them to read silently, because they can be making errors that may uh, play a detrimental role, may have a negative impact on their accuracy. So it's something to think about in terms of silent reading isn't either good or bad, but should be used judiciously depending on the developmental level of the students. In our book, Deb Glazer and I came up with this guideline for judging the effects of, or the impact, the quality, there you go, the quality of fluency instruction. Deb actually came up with this idea. I think it's really a clever way of taking this complex thing and making it relatively simple. If we were to come to your classroom to watch you do a fluency lesson, we would be looking for three major things, and all of them starting with A. Of course, we would be looking for your activities around building your students' accuracy, because first, foremost, and forever, it's accuracy that is the foundation of fluency. So whether you're teaching letter names and letter sounds, or how to read words, or having your students read connected text, we want to see you emphasizing accuracy for your students. Then all fluency lessons should also include automaticity, taking that accuracy in reading and then adding rate to it to move it along. If you're reading connected text, moving it towards sounding more and more like spoken language. If you're reading word lists, maintaining accuracy while you read those words with increasing speed. And the third A is the accessing meaning. The purpose of reading fluency is to connect students with comprehension and motivation, and that should be incorporated and part of every lesson that we consider a fluency lesson. So you can take that away and apply that to your own fluency lessons at whatever level you teach. Accuracy, automaticity, and make sure your students are accessing meaning through their work on fluency. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. I missed the opportunity to present live to you and listen to your questions, but I know there are ways that we can continue a conversation. I am active on Twitter. That's that at Jan Hasbrouck, and my Twitter feed is pretty narrowly focused around reading. And so I'd love to have you join that conversation. You can send an email or check out my website, and I would love to continue that conversation. So thank you for your interest in this topic, and I hope that this has helped you confirm your understandings around fluency or maybe expand your understandings a bit. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. I hope we continue our conversation.